Does it show that it's recording somebody?
Yes.
All right, very good. Welcome to Seed to Supper at Home Session 2. We're so glad you joining us today. Tonight's topics are building healthy soil, compost and fertilizer with Sue, and direct seeding and transplants with Lynn. We have a whole host of people that are in the background making polls and breakouts, and chats go very smoothly, and we're thankful to have all of you with. This is session 2 of 4. This is a condensed plan, so we meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Hank is going to run the poll today for our soil and fertilizer and compost sections.
Yes, I sure am. And tonight, just a reminder, this poll is only for the students, the participants tonight. So if you're a master gardener fired up, just hold on to your thoughts and allow the students to answer these questions. I'm going to go ahead and read the first question. We got 3 tonight. First question is, which best describes your previous gardening experience? And I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll now, and I will stop and share with everybody the results once that's complete. So which best describes your previous gardening experience?
Frank, we did this poll last week.
Right.
Yep. Okay.
Frank, you probably have to go to question number 5.
I will go right to it. Okay, got it. We're going to go ahead and end this poll as it is, and we'll go ahead and we're going to have 4 questions tonight. That one was a practice. All right, here we go.
That's the one that we had master gardeners answering it last time, so I jotted the answers. That was good.
All right.
I think this is more reflective of our participants. Okay, good.
All right, here we go. Session 2.
And just go ahead and launch it, and then you can read it.
12.
How would you describe the soil in which you are planning to grow vegetables? Okay, I think that's it.
Nice.
Okay, so the looks like mostly a combination, and that's probably what we have. This area is known for a lot of clay. However, most of you guys have a pretty decent mix. So, all right, we'll go ahead and start the next question. It also has to do with soil here. Okay, what kinds of fertilizers have you used in the past? Now, this is a multiple choice question, so you can choose more than one answer. Well, you can choose more than one. All right, and there are the results. Looks like mostly organic. Good, that's what we try to do, try to be good to the planet here, be sustainable about things. But we don't endorse anything. It's up to you to make that decision on what you use. Okay, this is the last question. Do you usually see plant starts? Do you usually use plant starts or sow seeds directly into the soil? This also may have more than one answer. right, pretty good mix of both direct seeding, which is the largest group of answers, and as well as plant starts from nurseries or other sources. So yeah, pretty good mix. All right, that concludes the polling session, and thank you for your input.
All right, can everybody see my screen? Judith, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, so today's topics, as we explained before, are all about soil fertilizer, seeds, and transplants. Thank you, Sue, for taking it on.
All right, so I guess it's my turn to talk here. Actually, this was supposed to ask you the question of what soil is, and then slowly tell you the answers, but it didn't work that way. So it's telling you the answers. But when you think about soil, do you realize that, you know, it's made up of air, water, organic matter, and broken pieces of rock? You know, that's kind of the question. If you look, there's another button there, another tab, Jennifer, one more. Yeah, so half of that soil is actually just pore space. It's the air and water is in that space between those broken pieces of rock and that organic matter. So that's what soil is. And soil is not the kind of stuff that you walk around outside and you get on your shoes and you bring it inside and you walk around your house and then you sweep it up and have to throw it in the garbage. That's dirt. Soil is something really valuable and really nice stuff if you work making it healthy to grow your vegetables. And those broken pieces of rock are that clay or sand or loam that we kind of talked about a little bit in that poll question. The combination of those pieces of rock. So that's what makes up the structure of your soil, is those pieces of rock. And next slide. So here's a pie chart that shows what the soil looks like. And as you see, that water and air is half of that soil. And then the broken rock takes up a whole bunch of space in that soil. And that organic matter is just a little tiny sliver over there. And it's a really small amount of material in that soil, but it's really, really important. Organic matter is anything that was once living and is now decomposed in the soil. And that, you know, like you might have clay soil or sandy soil, but that organic matter is really, really important because that can change the structure of your soil. You can't really change the texture of your soil. If you have clay soil, you just have clay soil. You can't like add a whole bunch of sand to it and turn it into sandy soil or do something like that, but you can add organic matter to make that soil healthier. So next slide. So here's a symptom of poor soil, some symptoms of poor soil. So if your soil looks like this, like right now, it's probably wetter than this. Like if it dries out for a while, it might start looking like this. This would be really pretty bad soil. And one thing that I could tell you about this soil is it's compacted. And sometimes compaction happens because you till too much or you till when it's wet. The soil's too wet to till. And also compaction could happen if you step on it a lot, you know, maybe not to this extreme, but, you know, if you were doing construction on your yard and you had tractors driving back and forth over your garden and it compacted the soil, this might be what it looked like. So this is really dry and really cracked. If it was really raining like it's been recently, maybe there would be puddles of water on top of the soil because this soil wouldn't absorb water very well. And this would be really, really hard to dig this soil. So to improve a soil like this, adding organic matter is what you need to do. And actually to improve any soil, adding organic matter is basically the answer. And mostly what we're going to talk about for organic matter is we're going to talk about compost and adding that to your soil to improve the quality of your soil. So the next slide, please. So I noticed that there's quite a few of you that are going to be doing container gardens, and sometimes like I might have garden beds, but then I have a few containers too. So it might help for everyone to listen to this. But there's some tips for container gardening. And one thing is that potting soil is really essential. You really need to, go out and buy potting soil. You can't do it any other way. The thing about container gardens is that when you plant them, there's not enough nutrients, even if that potting soil has fertilizer in it, there's not enough nutrients to last through the entire season. So what happens is when you do a container garden, you take a pot and you put some fertilizer in there, depending on, what you're planting and stuff, but, usually it's something like a half a cup of maybe all-purpose fertilizer, and then mix it in with the soil and plant your plant in there. And then throughout the season, you're gonna want to probably use a liquid fertilizer, and that seems to work the best is, so you take a liquid fertilizer, and usually what you do is you mix a couple tablespoons of a liquid fertilizer into a gallon of water, and then you would water the plants. And you would do that weekly, water that container plant with that fertilizer thing. Like, so basically all season long you would do that. The other thing about container gardens is that if you use that container last year and you pulled up the plant and there's a container full of soil, you should refresh that or replace it in the new year. So what you want to do is take that, dump all that soil out into a tarp or a piece of plastic. And then to refresh it, you could take 25% more compost than how much soil. So if you have 5 gallons of soil, 25% more of that, you add it to the soil, you mix it up, you put it back in the container with more fertilizer to start a new plant. I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. And you also take that pot before you fill it back up. You take it and you wash it out really well, and you sterilize it by using some kind of dilute hydrogen peroxide or bleach solution to clean up that pot and use it. And that's the way you would use the soil for a container garden. Next slide, please. So there is some pictures of some potting soil. And one thing that's very, very important is to not go out into your yard and dig up soil from your yard and put it in a pot and expect to grow vegetables, because it really doesn't work too well. And if you go out and buy potting soil, there's really a lot of quality differences in what the potting soil looks like. It's if you're going to grow in pots, it's good to invest in good potting soil. So the picture on the left there has is some potting soil, and in my opinion, that's pretty low quality potting soil. It has a lot of wood chunks and bark in it. And if you read the ingredients of that potting soil, probably the first ingredients would be wood chips or bark pieces or something like that. And I used to go out and buy the cheapest bags I could find of potting soil to fill up containers, because they're big containers when you're trying to grow a tomato. And that's the kind of stuff you would get, but you really need to invest in good quality potting soil. So the picture on the right is actually some potting soil that I made. And there's a recipe of potting soil in some of the participant handouts that we gave you. So you could make potting soil like this. So mostly this potting soil has, compost in it. It does have some potting mix in it. It has like a vermiculite or a perlite in it. That's that white stuff, those balls of white stuff in there. And it has compost in it. So that's basically how I mix those things together and make a potting soil that I would use for my my potted plants. And again, I'm losing my thoughts here. But the potting soil that you have to take from your pots and get rid of because you're dumping it out and replacing it or replenishing it and you don't need quite as much, you could take that potting soil and you could dump it in your compost or you could dump it in raised beds. So it's not just like you throw it away after you use it. You can use it like that. So next slide. So now I have some questions. So
Wendy, does Sue have any questions?
Wendy is going to tell me.
Sure. So we've had a lot of good questions here. I'll just start with Leah. What's the cheapest way to buy or make good potting soil?
It's good to invest in good quality potting soil and not find the cheapest. And probably the cheapest way to go is to actually make your own. And, we talked about that already. So,
okay. Where can we get compost from TK? How can we know that the compost is not contaminated by pesticide or herbicides?
The next section is going to be all on compost, so I will answer that later.
Okay. Okay. Very good. If a perennial is in a container, do I need to refresh that soil?
That gets a little harder to refresh it. If you can dig out some soil, that's good, but for sure you're going to have to fertilize it. Even, at the beginning of the season, it's good to try to fertilize that. But if you could up pot it, that would be one way to refresh the soil if you could do something like that. So it kind of depends.
No, I often will, on the bigger pots that I have, they're super heavy and I have perennials or woody kinds of plants in them. I try to at least mulch them with compost every year.
Yeah.
If I'm not moving them to the next size up because they're just too big anymore.
Yeah, good idea.
Do we have time for 2 more related questions?
I think we need to move on a little.
Okay, we'll save
Wendy,
these.
if you can save those, yeah, Sue might make up a little time as we go. Ooh.
Okay, we're talking about compost now. Just like potting soil, compost is not really created equal. There's different ways to get compost and use compost, and you could always go and buy compost in bags. There's that idea, but there's definitely different quality composts, and I might answer that question now. But way over on the left there's something called the PRC compost, and if you look at that compost, you could see a lot of wood in that, chunks of wood. That compost is from the Pacific Regent Compost Facility. So basically what you do is you take your yard debris container, you put your kitchen waste and your garden waste and your woody plants and wood, and you put it all in that yard debris container and you put it out, and the Republic Services takes it away with, every week. And what they do is they bring it to this plant out there near the dump, and they turn it into compost, and then they sell it back to you. So that's the PRC compost that you would get back. And I never can make enough compost, so I often buy that compost. And it's not as good quality as the stuff I could make. It's not as good as quality as the worm compost, but it definitely, you know, if you need compost, it's good. They do have, you know, information about the compost. You can get information, and I'm not sure where you get that. It used to be, you know, you could go online and you could find out what the quality of the compost was, and they tested to make sure it's not contaminated with things that shouldn't be contaminated with. So if you really you know, want to make sure that you have you know, kind of a safer compost, making it yourself is the best way if you can do that. But if you get organic certified compost, you have, you know, it's guaranteed to be herbicide free, I guess, is answering that question. Okay, so the second compost is some compost I made. And if you look, that compost has some white little balls in it. So it's probably like some vermiculite or some perlite from some soil that I dumped into my compost pile from a container. But that's compost is really nice, and it doesn't have a lot of that wood bark in it. And that stuff will decompose. It just kind of takes longer to decompose. And you know, basically in your soil. The worm compost by far is the best quality compost. It has the most nutrients in it. And the thing about worm compost is you don't really have to do a lot of work. You basically just dump your, you know, your compost feeds into the bin, and the worms do the work for you. So that compost is really nice. And there is a brochure that we're going to share with you, or a publication that will talk about composting with worms. But there's a lot of different ways to compost with worms. But that's some worm compost that my worms made for me. Next slide. So if you're making compost in your backyard, you need to think about what you're going to put in your compost pile. There's brown layers that are high in carbon, and there's green layers that are high in nitrogen. So the brown layers would be things like dry leaves, straw, sawdust, torn paper bags, corn husks, and shredded newspaper. And those things a lot of times will be brown. That's why they came up with the name brown layers. But the most important thing is that they're high in carbon. And a lot of times those layers will be dry. The green layers would be high in nitrogen and often really wet. But it would be the garden waste that you pull out of your garden, your kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, grass clippings, especially if those grass clippings are green and you just cut your lawn and you know, you took them and put them in the compost, it would be really high in nitrogen. If you let those dry out, then they turn into a brown carbon layer, but they're good for your compost. But if you use something like weed and feed on your lawn, they're not good for your compost. So the other thing you could put in is you could put pet hair, you could put human hair, has a lot of nitrogen in it, and you could put composted manure in your compost pile. The things you don't want to put in is meat, dairy, and bones. The thing about those will compost, but in backyard composting, you don't want to attract a lot of animals to your yard. So it's better to take those things and put them in the yard debris container, because then they'll go to the dump instead of your backyard, those animals. You don't want to put diseased plants in your compost pile. And you don't want to put weeds, especially invasive weeds that, or maybe weeds going to seed. Things like blackberry bushes and dandelions, especially those dandelion flowers that have lots of seed heads on them and stuff. You don't want to put those in your compost, but you can, again, put those in the yard debris container. You don't want to put any poop from animals, like meat-eating animals or from people in that compost bin. And then what you do with that compost pile is you do a layer of browns, a layer of greens, and you keep alternating those layers about 6 inches deep. And then if they're dry, you water them. If it's really raining a lot and they're wet, you don't have to worry about that, but you water as you go if it needs water. And you continue until that pile is about 3 feet high, and then you let it sit for a couple weeks, and then you turn it. So next slide, please. So this is some cover crop that I pulled out of the garden, or we pulled out of the garden, but we pulled a lot of cover crop. And this is only about, probably 6 or 8 inches of cover crop. So that grassy looking stuff is probably like a wheat or a rye that was pulled out of the garden. And then up on top of that, there's a whole bunch of spinach roots and stems and leaves that are there, but that's definitely a green layer, and that's, at least 6 inches deep. And then the next slide. And then there's, on top of that, I put some straw. So, and if you look at that straw, it looks really dry. So at this point, you probably want to water that straw. And if it's really raining a lot, it might be a good idea to cover that compost, but that's basically how you make compost. The next slide, please. So the way to do compost that works really well is to have 2 bins next to each other. This guy has, a lot more than 2 bins, but 2 bins next to each other. And that way you can turn your compost from one bin into the other bin. The size should be 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, like a cubic yard at least, or bigger than that. And the reason for that is because you want that to heat up and start decomposing, and that volume will start, start that action with all the microbes in that compost. This guy used pallets for his bins, and pallets are good because they're already 3 feet by 3 feet, big. So pallets, and pallets, you can go around town and you can get pallets for free. So it's a really good choice for making compost bins. The thing about pallets is you want to make sure they have something called, letters HT, meaning heat treated, because the chemically treated pallets, you probably don't want to put that in your compost or anywhere near your garden, but those heat treated pallets are really good. You could use boards or old fencing, like cedar fencing is a really good thing to make bins out of, but you don't need to make bins. You can just put your compost pile on the ground. And it's really important that it's open on the bottom, because that contact with the ground is really important for making compost. So you do want that compost bin to be open on the top of the bottom. I will cover my compost usually over the winter because it rains so much, but as the weather gets nice, I uncover it and let the air get in there. Next slide, please. So what you do with that compost is, if it's a new garden, you would put about 3 or 4 inches of compost on your new garden bed and mix it in some. And if it's a place where you're gardening year after year, you could add 1 or 2 inches of compost, but every year you should add compost to a vegetable garden, to the soil, or even to your container gardens. And next slide. So Wendy's going to help us with some more questions now.
Okay, a lot of good specific questions on where do you site a compost bin? Do you want that in the sun or in the shade, or does it matter?
That doesn't really matter. It's more important that it's convenient for you, or if it's kind of gets a little messy, maybe a little further away from where you would see it a lot, but it just easy access to it to take that compost and then spread it in your garden. That's probably more important than sun or shade.
Okay, and can we start adding compost now to our beds, or is it too wet?
You could add compost to your beds even if it's wet, but don't till your ground or don't mix it around until it dries out. But you could add the compost, that's fine. You would probably want to weed first. But.
So Sue, let's move on. I think we're running a few minutes slow because of our breakouts, but if we'll continue on, we can talk about fertilizer.
Okay. So fertilizing, that's what I'm going to talk about now. Now, the thing about fertilizing, before you even get started with talking about fertilizing, it's really a good idea to do a soil test. If you've never gardened in that spot before, it's a really good idea to do a soil test. And it's a really good idea if you have gardened there for 3 or 5 years to do a soil test, every 3 to 5 years. So there's a brochure or publication that we have, the extension has, that will tell you how to take a soil sample so you could do this soil test. So that will be available to you. What the soil test does is it measures the pH of your soil. So it tells you whether your soil is acid or alkaline, and it tells you where in that range it is. Vegetable gardens do better between 6 and 7 on that chart. So it's really important to know what your pH is. And the soil test will also measure your NPK. And the NPK stands for nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus and potassium, sorry. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Again, it's really good to do this soil test so you know what your garden needs or what it's lacking. If you have questions about it, you could call Master Gardens. But one thing that Master Gardeners do here in Corvallis is they do a free pH test. It's not a whole soil test, but it's a free pH test. And if nothing else, it's good to do a pH test with your garden, because then you know if you're in the right range. A lot of times you have the nutrients in your soil, but if the pH is a little bit off, your plants don't have access to those nutrients. So it's really important to get the pH adjusted right. So if you add lime or sulfur, and usually in the Willamette Valley, you would add lime to your soil to adjust the pH, because our soil tends to be a little acidic. So you're adding the lime to increase the pH. So the next slide, please. So the 3 key nutrients that you are going to find in a bag of fertilizer that's important for your plants are that NPK, or the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And every bag of fertilizer should have those numbers on it. So you know that that's 15% nitrogen and 5% phosphorus and 10% potassium. So those numbers will tell you. And what you want to look for when you look for fertilizer is something called a complete fertilizer, or an all-purpose fertilizer, or maybe a vegetable fertilizer. But those 3 key nutrients are really important in your soil. But what's also important is 13 micronutrients. And doing that soil test will tell you what your soil is lacking. And it could be something really, really pretty insignificant, you think, like one of those micronutrients, but adding that to your soil can really improve the vegetables that you grow. And usually those soil tests, when you do the whole soil test, not just the pH test, you send them off to a lab, and we have a link to that labs in Oregon, but you send it off to your soil sample off to a lab, and it usually costs anywhere between $35 and $65, but it's definitely a good thing to do, especially if you're struggling growing certain vegetables you know, it might be some of those micronutrients that you have to adjust in your soil. And you don't know that unless you, you get a soil test. Next slide, please. So there's some samples of fertilizer. And if you notice, there's an all-purpose fertilizer that comes in a box there, and it has an NPK. And those NPKs numbers are pretty lower. That's because that's an organic fertilizer. But that would work good. It kind of shows a picture of a tomato on it. So it would be a good fertilizer to use in a vegetable garden. Also, that bottle of fish fertilizer on the right is, you know, has an NPK written on it. And that would be something that you would use, you know, maybe throughout the growing season more than, you know, putting it in your, you know, under your plant that you're actually growing. So the next slide, please. One way to put fertilizer in your ground is, you know, of course, read the instructions on the boxes or the bottles, and, you know, it'll tell you how much to use in your, you know, for your plant that you're growing. But if you want to look up specific plants, you could use the territorial seed catalog that we supplied to you, that you should have all gotten by now, I think. And it has really good information beyond just, you know, buying a lot of seeds, but it'll tell you how much fertilizer to use. And it's usually like a complete fertilizer mix, but it will tell you how much to use for that particular plant you're growing. So maybe you would say, if you're growing 5 feet of spinach, you put, you know, half a cup of all-purpose fertilizer or complete fertilizer mix in that 5-foot section. And we are supplying in your container garden handout, we are supplying a recipe for you making your own fertilizer, which again is the cheapest way to do it, is to make your own fertilizer. But we're sending a recipe to you, and that would be one way to use it, because you don't have a box or a package to read how much fertilizer to use, but you could look in the territorial and use that much fertilizer. So it's a really good resource. Next slide, please.
So Sue, I'm gonna do.
I think I only have one more
slide. Okay.
Oh no, I have 2. Oh, okay, this you'll find in your book. Next slide. Okay,
You'll find in your book too.
You can just look at that real quick, but next slide, please. That's the last thing I wanted to say is, if you want to grow an organic garden, you would look for that symbol to find whether it's organic or not. So it just helps you know what's organic. So I'm done.
Thank you, Sue. I want to remind you all, please continue to put questions in the chat. Even though we aren't able to take the time to answer the questions during the session, we will make every effort to get you links and information in the follow-up emails.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. So let's see here. There's a question on pH.
So Wendy, I think
Oh,
we'll move on to seeds, and then if at the end we have some time, we'll do that. Again, we're running a little bit low, so I'm just going to transition straight to Lynn's section on seeds. Thank you, Lynn.
Okay. I'm Lynn, and now we're going to talk about what I think is one of the funnest parts of the gardening, and that is planting things. There are 2 ways to plant. You can plant seeds in the ground, or you can plant transplants in the ground. Transplants, they also refer to as starts. So first off, seeds. Why would you plant seeds? Well, there are some good reasons. Generally, seeds are less expensive than buy-in baby plants. You know, a package of seeds might cost, I don't know, $2.95 for a package of seeds for, say, lettuce. Whereas a 6-pack transplants could cost $3.95, $4.95, $5.95, and you've only got 6 plants. So seeds are less expensive. There are a lot more varieties. Most nurseries and garden centers stock just a few kinds, the most popular kinds of lettuce or kale or whatever. You can find a lot more kinds if you look at the seed racks. And another great reason is that seeds, besides being cheaper, usually last for more than 1 year. You're probably not going to use all the seeds in your seed packet. Who needs all that many zucchini plants, for example? So just save them and you can use them the next year. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. The other option is transplants, and you see some examples of transplants here. On the right are some transplants of tomatoes in a greenhouse somewhere. On the left is an example of a 6-pack of transplants. This happens to be for strawberries that you might find at a garden center or a nursery. A reason to do transplants is that gives you a real head start rather than planting just a seed. So it gains you some time. And it's especially important for things that need a long, hot season, like tomatoes. Those transplants, being bigger, are also better able to compete with weeds that might be sprouting up near them. The transplants are bigger, and so they do better in the competition for water and nutrients. Next slide. So how do you decide whether you should be doing seeds or transplants? There are certain crops that do best if you direct seed them. And you see 2 examples to the right: beans on the top, carrots on the bottom. And you'll see in this chart, which is in your book, page 54, some examples of things that you would use seed for. Things with large seeds like beans and corn and peas are best direct seeded. Things that are root crops like carrots and radishes and beets are best direct seeded. And then there are some miscellaneous other ones like garlic. You're not really going to plant seeds, but you're not going to transplant garlic. Next slide. There are some plants that have to be transplanted in our climate. You can't grow tomatoes or peppers or eggplant from seed. Those, no questions asked, have to be grown from a transplant. And then there are a few where you have a choice. You could plant seeds, you could plant a transplant. It's sort of your preference, or how soon do you want it to ripen? You could plant kale from a seed, it'll grow fine, or you could plant a transplant of kale and it'll grow fine, but you'll be eating it sooner. Next slide. Direct seeding, we're going to talk about, which means putting seed directly into the ground. The first resource is the seed packet. It really has everything you could possibly want to know about that crop and the specific variety you're growing. On the left, you see the front side of a package for tomato seeds from Territorial Seeds. It says it's tomatoes. It says that it's the gold nugget variety. That 60 days means it's going to be 60 days from the time you put out the plant till you can begin harvesting the tomatoes. More important stuff is on the back, more important stuff about planting. In the column on the left, it tells you how deep to plant the seeds, 1/4 inch, what the soil temperature needs to be for success, 70 to 90 degrees, that it needs full sun. That's important. If you have some shady areas, look for whether it needs full sun or can take some shade. How far apart the plant should be in the end, 18 to 30 inches in this case. Yes, that's smaller than what Emily told you it should be for tomatoes, but these, you'll notice on the front, it says compact bushes. This would be a good variety for a container. And it also tells you when to start your seeds or plant them outside over here to the right. If you're going to grow transplants in the house to put out later, it says start those 6 to 8 weeks before your average last frost date. That differs from place to place. Here in Corvallis, the average last frost date's around April 23rd, 25th, something like that. Notice under sowing outdoors, it says not recommended. That's what I was just saying. You don't want to grow tomatoes from out of from direct seeding. At the very bottom, it's not underlined, but at the very bottom, it says usual seed life 3 years. So if you're going to save these, they'll be good for 3 years. Next slide. If you save seeds, you want to put them in, you want to save them properly. Store those seeds in a cool, dark place. The left-hand side shows a nice tin container with a lid. It would be nice and dark inside. You can just throw all your seeds in a container like that, or a shoebox or something. The metal is nice because it will stay dark and dry in there. Or if you want to get more organized, you can store things by the type of seed they are. You could have a jar or a Tupperware container for the beans and one for the carrots. However you want to do it, however organized you want to get. Whichever method you use, you want to keep it dry in there. So grab one of those little silica packets that comes in your shoe boxes, sometimes always in pill bottles, and throw that in with your seeds to keep them nice and dry. Next slide. So once you've got these seeds in the ground, what do they need to actually sprout? They don't need light yet because they're not up yet, but they do need moisture, and you'll do that by watering them. But they also need warmth, and that's kind of a critical question. Next slide. How warm is warm enough? How warm do they need to be? This is a table in your book with some examples. It's on page 56, but I only included it here to show you the wide range in the minimum soil temperatures that they require. You see, I've highlighted corn. The soil has to be 60 to 65 degrees in order for corn to germinate. Whereas peas, the other yellow arrow, says the soil only needs to be 34 or 36 degrees. So you could already have peas in the ground now. February often, well, I planted mine in February. So some things like that, onions too, are very early. Next slide. But that temperature, remember, is the soil temperature, not the air temperature. So you have to know what the temperature of the soil is if you're going to use the temperature as your guide. This is a picture of a soil thermometer. This is mine. So you just stick this in the ground and it'll tell you what the temperature of the soil is. Or you can use another method to decide when to plant. Next slide. So another way you can tell is to look at the back of the seed package. Seed packages generally describe when it's appropriate to plant in one of two ways. Some seed packets, like the one on the left, says recommended 2 to 4 weeks before the average last frost. Well, we just said the average last frost is around April 25th. 4 weeks before that would be March 25th. So you could put your chard seeds, this is chard, you could put your chard seeds in the ground very soon. Actually, you could do it now. No, it says 4 weeks. You could do it very soon and they'd be fine. They would germinate. Other seed packets, specifically the ones from Territorial Seeds, which are grown, Territorial is in Cottage Grove, so they're in the Willamette Valley. They describe that you can sow these seeds outside from March through mid-July. So you could start sowing these seeds now. They know when the average last frost is around here. So this is, you can't tell because you're not looking at the front. This is carrot seeds. So carrot seeds could be sown right now. Next slide. How you sow them is up to you. I won't go into this in detail, but there are a couple ways you can plant. You can plant in the traditional rows, but one way you might like to plant, especially if you don't have a lot of room, is to use bands. If you have, say, you want some lettuce, you could plant a square foot solid with lettuce seeds. I mean, not a whole lot, but don't worry about rows. Just sprinkle lettuce seeds in there, let them sprout, thin them out a little bit, and then that whole square foot is going to be full of lettuce or spinach or carrots or whatever you want to plant. The hill method is mostly for big bushy things like zucchini, cucumbers, squash, winter squash. And you can accomplish that by just spacing them out, but I'll let you read more about that in the book. Let's go to the next slide. How deep you plant them, well, it says on the package, but just as an explanation for why those depths vary is because the size of the seeds vary. Some of these seeds, of course, you've seen. You know what a pea looks like. You know what a green bean seed looks like, but you've probably never seen a broccoli seed. And it's kind of surprising. Look how small the broccoli seed is in the third row compared to the radish seed in the middle of the fourth row. I mean, you know how big broccoli is and how big radishes are. Look at the disproportionate sizes of the seeds. A general rule of thumb, if for some reason you don't have a packet, maybe somebody gave you seeds, you usually want to plant them about 3 times as deep as the size of the seed, the longest part of the seed. It's on the seed packet, so most of the time you just look there. Next slide. When you've planted, whether it's in rows or a band or what, do label it. You want to remember that you've actually planted something there and what it is. What's coming up? Is that spinach? Is that lettuce? What is it? So remember to make labels and put on it what it is that you planted and stick it in right where you planted that row. These you don't have to spend money on plant labels. You can just cut up a yogurt container like was done here, or there are other ways to make popsicle sticks if you have those, or anything that you can cut into little slips like this. The other thing that I usually do is I note on the label when it was planted, so I know when I might expect to see something coming up, but that's up to you. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to show
So
you.
Lynn, if we are short on time, do you want to do the video on direct seeding or transplanting? We can send the link. We can send the link to the everyone.
Okay, probably the seeding since we're here.
Okay. I think Judith is going to run the.
Jennifer, you need.
All right. Are you viewing my screen now?
Yes, we see it.
Good. All
Good.
right.
Oh, the last thing on direct seeding is, like I said in the video, you're going to have to thin. This shows carrots. They're going to come up, they're going to be beautiful, and you're going to have to kill some. You have to be ruthless. If you don't thin your carrots, they will grow, but they'll be misshapen. They'll be wrapped around each other, all curled up. You won't, and they'll be small. So you have to thin them. When you're thinning, cut them with a scissors, with a snipper like you see here, or pinch them with your fingernail. Don't pull them out, or you'll disturb the remaining little seedlings. And what your goal is to get them thinned to the spacing that was on the seed packet. And you see at the bottom of the screen, the part of the seed packet for carrots. You want to get them to be 1 to 3 inches apart. I would usually aim for closer to the 3 than the 1 inch. They're going to be small carrots then. Okay, next. Transplanting is a whole different ball game. You can buy transplants in a 6-pack like I showed you with the strawberries, or you can buy larger plants like tomatoes or peppers in a larger pot. So this is these are 2 examples of tomato transplants, and you want to pick ones that are most likely to be successful. Pick healthy ones. It might surprise you that the one that says yes is the one that's on the right. The one on the left isn't a great choice for two reasons. One is the roots. Notice the difference in the roots between the left one and the right one. On the left plant, the roots, there are a lot of roots, and they're sort of wrapped around and they're coming up the side. This plant, that means this plant is a little root bound. It's been in the pot for too long. Whereas the one on the right, yes, it has some healthy roots, but it doesn't have those big wads of roots like you see on the left. The other thing is that the plant on the left is a little spindly. It's tall, it's much taller than the one on the right, but the main stem is a little thinner and the branches coming off are thinner. If you look at the one on the right, it's got a nice fat, stocky stalk, and the leaves there look healthier than the ones on the left. So that's and the little branches coming off of the main branch are healthier too. So that's a better choice. Next slide. When you plant these tomatoes, you want to plant them at the appropriate spacing, like you saw in the common crop chart and like Emily showed you in the video last week. They're going to look like they're way too far apart, but remember, these tomatoes are going to get big, so you want to plant them probably 36 inches from center to center, or at least close to that amount. These have cages around them because your tomatoes are going to need some kind of support as they grow. Next slide is my transplanting demo. So you want to skip this tonight?
We do have time for the video, but then it will not have time for questions. Your choice, Lynn.
Well, are there a lot of questions? Let me look at the chat.
Wendy?
Yeah, you may want to jump to questions, I guess.
Okay,
And I was
so
going to say, we're pretty caught up on questions, I think. There's a,
Okay, well then show the demo quickly and we'll see how many questions we can get to. This last slide is just to remind you that you don't necessarily have to buy transplants. You can grow your own if you choose. And Judith has made a terrific video on how to do that at home. You'll get a link for that in the chat if you want to try growing some of your own starts for your garden. And that's it for me.
all right. Thank you, Lynn. I'm glad we could watch the videos. A video is an amazing thing, much better than just a PowerPoint still picture. Thank you all for joining us this evening at Seed to Supper at Home Session 2. We will get to your chat questions, and I will do a follow-up email tomorrow and have links to Judith's video on growing seeds indoors and other things answering your questions. We look forward to seeing you next week on Tuesday. And Frank, do you want to jump in with one short reminder about homework?
Sure. Yeah, everyone had a really great start on the sketch. And so basically you're just going to finish that out and just focus on just that area where you're going to plant things. So just that raised bed. Don't need to have everything else around it. And make sure that you have properly accounted for the spacing and using that crop chart to plan out where things are going to go and take into consider all the things that we covered earlier next week. But I'm pretty confident you guys will not have a problem. If you do, you've got my email and you're welcome to give me an email if you have any questions about it. Good luck.
There is one question in the chat we probably should answer before we leave, and that is about all these links that were given in the chat. Will those be in the recording that we are making, or are all the chats eliminated in the recording?
Yes, the chats I will save. So then I'll make notes of any of the links that that Wendy put in the chat, and I will include that in the email. These are also being put into the Google Drive. So you have a folder of participant materials that have the the Seed to Supper participants guides and the ones in Spanish, and the container information. So that folder will continue to grow and grow with different information in there. So in my follow-up email, I'll put the latest information, and then I'll also attach the Google Drive that will have the videos and other things that you can access.
Right.
So Tuesday, we will be talking about caring for your garden. That's Tuesday, March 16th. And we'll have talk more specifically about watering, protecting young plants, weeds, insects, and we'll have a round of good bug, bad bug. So we look forward to seeing you next week. And if we have leaders, please stay on and we'll do our debrief after the class. Thank you so much for attending. Bye-bye.
Jennifer, I think you could stop recording now.
Mm.